Yo, what's up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So obviously right now the talk of the town is Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. That is the fight in the heavyweight division. And let's be honest, that is the fight in boxing right now. But, a couple of roadblocks do actually exist for this fight to happen. One of which being the sanctioning bodies, namely the WBO, in regards to Anthony Joshua fighting his mandatory Alexander Usyk. Now, a lot of people, including Eddie Hearn, have been throwing shade at the WBO for enforcing their mandatory, which of course is Alexander Usyk. First and foremost, one thing I want to add before we get into this video is that it's funny. With Dillian Whyte, when he was the WBC Mando, before Alexander Povetkin knocked him out, a lot of these same people who were criticising the WBO were basically begging the WBC to enforce Dillian Whyte as Tyson Fury's mandatory, therefore Tyson Fury fights Dillian Whyte before he fights Anthony Joshua. But when the WBO declare Alexander Usyk as the mandatory, and therefore potentially risking Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury not being fought undisputed, it's funny, these same people who were stringing the Dillian Whyte violin, calling for him to get a title shot before Joshua versus Fury, these same people now are kind of saying sanctioning bodies don't matter, mandatories should not get in the way of undisputed. Me personally, I've been very, very consistent on this whole issue. Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua is the fight. Whether a couple of belts have to be vacated or not, that is the fight that should happen ASAP, regardless of mandatory scenarios. I've been very consistent on that way before Dillian Whyte got knocked out by Povetkin. So these same people who were crying for Dillian Whyte to get a title shot, all I would ask is, why are you not pushing for the same thing for Alexander Usyk? That's all I would ask. But regardless, this whole WBO mandatory situation is a big topic in regards to Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua, and Eddie Hearn insinuated that maybe boxing is better off without these sanctioning bodies, and maybe promoters should actually start to boycott the sanctioning bodies in a sense. That's what Eddie Hearn has basically been insinuating, and while I totally agree, I believe these sanctioning bodies need to be reformed. They need to be on the same page in regards to certain scenarios, including undisputed or unification fights. I believe a unification fight or an undisputed title fight should take precedent over any mandatory challenger. I think it would be good for boxing if the sanctioning bodies at least agreed upon that. I think that would be a step in the right direction. But certainly, the sanctioning bodies need to be reformed, because let's be honest, right now they are committing a little bit of fuckery now and again. That much is fair. So yeah, I totally agree with the criticism that these sanctioning bodies are getting, especially in regards to this situation, and I actually understand why certain people would actually come to the conclusion that boxing would be better off without some of these sanctioning bodies. However, I do believe these sanctioning bodies do offer some importance to boxing as it currently stands. First and foremost, you would have to ask yourself a question. What is the alternative of sanctioning bodies in boxing? To me, the alternative would be for one sanctioning body to rule the roost. That would be ideal. However, that is not practical, let's be honest about it. It's not going to happen. And Eddie Hearn's suggestion is basically to create our own belts. What does that mean? That basically means promoters create their own titles. If that is the case, the same problem is going to ensue. Let's say the sanctioning bodies are boycotted by promoters and the promoters create their own belts. You're going to have the same problem. The PBC are going to create their belt, Eddie Hearn's going to create his belt, Top Rank are going to create their belt. If we come to that scenario where the promoters have their own belts, I guarantee you boxing will be a lot worse off, because promoters and fights are going to be a lot more insular, a lot more in-house than they already are. Basically, Eddie Hearn is advocating for a UFC model, and that wouldn't work in boxing. Nobody has the monopoly right now. Boxing is far too fragmented, and let's say the mainstream promoters were to actually boycott the sanctioning bodies, and they basically create their own belts, I believe boxing would actually be worse off, because these guys would even be less likely to fight each other, for obvious reasons in which I shouldn't even really have to spell out. So what is the alternative? In an idealistic world, there would be one sanctioning body, but think about it. Even that right now is untenable because let's be honest, right? In modern day boxing, a lot of these guys fight once a year. And if you're a champion in modern day boxing, with one sanctioning body fighting once a year, there's numerous guys, world-class fighters who will never get a title shot or will have to wait for a long, long time. And to me, given the current state of boxing, that is not really all that realistic, let's be honest. I think right now 4 sanctioning bodies, given how infrequently these guys fight, is probably the best way to go about it, to be honest. And another thing people don't consider is with sanctioning bodies, of course they order mandatory defences. So there's certain guys who without a mandatory shot would never get a shot at a title. Let's take Artur Beterbiev for example. Obviously Artur Beterbiev won his world title by becoming the IBF mandatory. In fact, he was mandatory when Andre Ward was still active. He was Andre Ward's mandatory before Andre Ward retired. But let's be honest, if Artur Beterbiev was not a mandatory contender, would this sort of guy get a title shot? Artur Beterbiev is not a draw. He's a Russian guy who relocated to Canada. He's not a big ticket seller. He's not a mainstream fighter, but he's a very good fighter. Would that sort of guy get a title shot without a mandatory position? More than likely, no. And the alternative to the sanctioning bodies, potentially, you could have a lot of fighters who never actually get the chance to fight for glory and fight for a world title. You know, if there's one sanctioning body and these guys are fighting once a year, there's a lot of guys who are going to miss out, and God only knows what would happen if promoters had their own belts. In fact, I believe it would be even worse than it currently is. So as bad as the sanctioning bodies currently are, and let's be honest, I think we all agree, they are not all operating in an ideal manner, but despite that, I've not heard one realistic, viable alternative to the sanctioning bodies. I've not heard one. I've heard people say mandatories should no longer exist, which I believe is a big no-no because ultimately that means a lot of fighters would never get a title shot. I've heard people say there should only be one sanctioning body, and let's be honest, in an idealistic world, that is the solution, but these guys don't fight enough for that to be viable. So what is the alternative to the 4 sanctioning bodies? I've not heard one good argument against them, to be honest with you. Again, I certainly agree the sanctioning bodies need to be reformed. They need to be more willing to make unification fights. Like I said, maybe have a rule and they all agree upon it that if a unification fight or an undisputed fight is being negotiated, then that fight takes priority over a mandatory. I think all of the sanctioning bodies should agree upon that. That would be a great start as far as I'm concerned. But you know, the alternative to sanctioning bodies, I believe it's a case of be careful what you wish for, because if these promoters manage to abolish the sanctioning bodies or boycott them and make their own titles, I guarantee you boxing will be a lot worse off for it. We already see how unwilling a lot of these guys are to work with each other. Imagine if these guys had their own title belts. It's going to be even worse as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, I don't really believe right now there's many realistic alternatives to the 4-belt era in boxing. Again, especially considering the climate of boxing right now, where a lot of these big name guys fight once a year. What is the alternative? I've not heard one realistic scenario in opposition to the sanctioning bodies. I've not heard one. Again, in an idealistic world, there will be one sanctioning body where the champion fights 4 or 5 times a year. That's not going to happen. You know, we're not in the 50s anymore. You know, these guys fought more than that a year. We're not in that era anymore. So, you guys can name me the alternative and I'll listen, but I don't really see what it is. But anyway, share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.